So, welcome back to Savage Fabrication Instant Spool Performance. We're going to be going over nozzle sizes, and turbine housings, what they do, and why it matters. So, figuring out the flow through them is a little bit tricky because they're a circle, but we can use curtain area, which I don't think I have it written down. Hold on, let me do that real quick. Okay, so we're back. Instant Spool Performance. We're going to go over, I got asked to be more scientific, I guess, in my ways of looking at things. So one of the big things is the speed through the nozzle. This is not always where peak torque is located, but typically the reason peak torque lands where it does on turbo diesels is because the turbine side is in choke flow. As soon as the turbine side's in choke flow, drive pressure starts to get above boost. As the engine RPM continues to rise, drive pressure just keep going up, and it'll climb at a rate faster than the boost rate climb does. Boost will tend to still continue to climb up a little bit as this occurs, mainly due to the temperature. EGTs should be going up at this point, and as the EGTs go up, the speed of sound, because the heat in here goes up, the speed of sound will go up with it. But once you're in this condition, you can't really solve it with more EGT. The amount of EGT you'd have to add to try and get that location to move substantially typically would result in broken engine parts. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about the nozzle? I'm going to turn on this light here so we can see. This is the bolt 10-9. The nozzle is the section from here to here, this throat opening. So that's our nozzle, and there's two main kinds, divided and undivided nozzles. So here's a factory 12, has a divided nozzle. Like we have a divided inlet, we have a divided nozzle, and the divider protrudes into the nozzle, a substantial amount. Why does that matter? Well, got to understand how the turbine housing works, what it does. The turbine housing is a control device. So why is it a control device? It's controlling expansion rate and speed through the nozzle that's attacking the turbine wheel to produce shaft torque for the turbocharger. So how this works is, as soon as exhaust gas exits the well, as soon as it's always trying to expand, and we want to control that expansion. It needs to expand a certain amount. If we try and not let it expand enough, we're going to move the choke location somewhere else in the system. We'll move it up to the head if the head's too small. We can move it into the exhaust manifold if the manifold's too small. But the easiest way to think about it is it's always trying to expand, and we can control that expansion. So control that expansion based on the size of the runner through the head on the exhaust port. So we can let it expand so much, and then next it gets into the exhaust manifold. The exhaust manifold in turbo diesel applications, well, all applications, but we really like log manifolds and turbo diesels, and all a log manifold really does is move a pressure and heat signal with a mass volume from the exhaust port to the turbocharger. So the next expansion stage is the exhaust manifold. You'll notice this when you increase the exhaust manifold size, the exhaust gas is allowed to expand more, and when you put that on the exact same turbocharger with the exact same cam and head, but you make the exhaust manifold larger, it'll move peak torque typically to the right. So it'll kill a little bit of the torque down low, but because we're getting more expansion on the manifold before it goes into the housing is going to carry out to a little bit higher RPM. Typically, this almost always results in more wheel horsepower because the volumetric efficiency of the motor is carrying better up to those higher engine speeds, and because it's doing that, the engine consumes more. The engine consumes more of what the turbo is supplying and what's available. You end up with more power production, more air to burn, and get more fuel out of that. So the next thing in line is the turbine housing. I'm gonna put a jacket on, it's getting cool. So the next thing in line is the turbine housing, and there's all kinds of different sizes for all kinds of different applications. So like I said, we have a factory 12 centimeter housing. There's a 351 CW 9 centimeter. This one's already been machined out. Another 9 for an S300. Bolt-in, drop-in 9 that I think. There's a go grab this. Bolt-in 9 centimeter HX40 outlet. So it's essentially the same housing as the 351, but it's been modified to accept a 3540 cartridge instead of the 351 cartridge. Put that up here. It's a .91 T4 S300 housing. So it's divided. It's all taped up, but there's a divider in there. Here's like a .63 T3 T4 housing. The gate's part of the wastegate flap. You can see as far as size goes, different housing. Undivided. And one big nozzle instead of two. I believe this is a 10. Oh, I can't even tell anymore. I think this is a 10. Yeah, it's like a 10 S400 T4 housing. Divided. It's a mess, but I was able to measure the nozzle section for the neck. So I guess we get the idea at this point. All kinds of different housings, all designed to do different things. So I was just talking to someone. My job as the turbo builder is to listen to where you want to operate the motor and decide what housing is going to allow the proper amount of expansion in the housing, and then net the proper amount of flow through the nozzle to locate you where you want to be as far as where we're going to put peak torque and peak horsepower, because that's essentially what the turbine housing does on turbo diesel. It's going to locate where peak torque's at, and it's going to locate where peak horsepower is at. So depending on what RPM range you want to drive in is going to depict where I'm going to place you housing size, or what housing you want to choose. There's no best housing that just does everything amazing. It's my job's using data off the dyno, street driven data, customer feedback, and all that stuff over the course of how many years I've been doing this to get you into the housing that's going to make the motor respond in a way that you're looking for. Why do divided housings tend to flow less than undivided housings? I think the best way to look at this is to use curtain area. Normally you use curtain area for looking at the flow through a valve based on lift. It's probably not the most perfect way to do this, but I think it does the job well enough. There are nozzle flow mathematics for doing this. A lot of it is metric and a little bit tricky to figure out, because at this point you're going to have to go look at this localized speed of sound and other things that are going on. I think the best way, if you want to really get down and dirty into it, is to do what we're doing, and that's measuring pressure pre-turbine wheel and measuring pressure after the turbine wheel. Working on getting the truck running that's going to have this setup on it. There's two of them. One has compounds and one has a single, and that's going to let us get a really good understanding of this with all different kinds of housings. So let's go to the notebook. Curtain area, and I'm going to put a picture in here of it, but what it is, its curtain area is valve diameter times 0.98 times 3.14 pi times the lift. So what we can do, and it's really just the process reversed, is this opening is the valve size. The throat size is the lift. This allows us to look at curtain area. And you can add curtain areas together. So if you ever want to, I did this a while ago and should make a video on it, but if you look at the curtain area of a 24 valve versus the curtain area of the 12 valve, at 0.3 lift, they're almost the same. What the 24 valve does better than the 12 valve is it opens that curtain area faster. So the rate of time that the valve is lifting versus curtain area exposure occurs faster than it does with the 2 valve motor. Once you get into looking at the curtain areas past the 0.1 and 0.1 and 0.2 marks, the areas begin to look the same. The big thing is the 24 valve gets to those faster, and that's more than likely why the 24 valve does such a better job at producing that torque. Yep, sorry about that. So one of the big takeaways from that is that Cummins isn't dumb. When you start looking at the velocity, the port velocity through the head and what they're doing, they're quite dead on with what it should be for where they're trying to operate that motor. When they came out with the 24 valve, or should I say came out, when they went to the 24 valve, they chose valve sizes and port sizes that are equal a total target that is very similar to what the 12 valve is. It just does everything quicker, which is fine because they're not screwing with the port velocity. If they screwed the port velocity, they would kill the low end torque. How we know about killing the port velocity is myself and 4 other people that are all on the same head all have issues trying to get their rigs to make torque at 1500 and below. And it's because that particular head is not designed to operate down at those low engine speeds. The velocity's slow. It is a high swirl head, but the swirl is slow. I used to think swirl is irrelevant, but after listening to some interesting talks by people that are much smarter than me, it does matter that the head creates the swirl and the swirl speed below certain RPMs. In this talk, it was about everything basically kind of below 2500. Was real important that the head contributes to the swirl numbers. After about 2500 RPMs, they're getting all the swirl that they need through the air motion through the valve. That probably goes for just about any motor. You're getting so much turbulence and funky stuff going on with the flow once the air speed and the piston speed's getting up that high. That doesn't matter anymore. And that seems to hold true for when we look at the sled pulling stuff in the diesel world and drag race stuff in the diesel world operating at those higher engine speeds. We seem to be getting plenty of mixture motion just out of that piston speed. But when you're talking about stuff that's, especially now at 1500 RPMs, the head is contributing to that mixture motion. And even if it's a high swirl head, if it's a high swirl head with bigger valves and bigger ports, the swirl speed is going to be too slow for the motor to properly produce cylinder pressure down at those lower engine speeds. This isn't just my experience, this is the experience of 2 local people that I've been by, paired with 2 more people that have helped online trying to get their rigs to run properly. All on the same head, all experiencing the exact same things. Okay. So we can see that's important, and the curtain area and all that stuff. A little bit of a tangent, but back to turbine housings. We went over the how to find curtain area, and as such, I went and measured every housing that I have here. So I in fact have, this is a T3 Borg HX40 outlet, the fancy wastegate, re-entry. There we go. This is for the AE71 turbine from BD. Divided housing. And we have all of our nozzle openings. On the divided housings, there's 2 of them, so we have to add them together. On the undivided, there's 1 big one. So, stock 12 centimeter. It's actually two different sizes for the up and lower. This isn't uncommon. You do want to check both sides. Typically the lower one's bigger than the top one. So our upper is a 0.140 inch and our lower is a 0.160 inch. The opening is 3.040 inch. So our curtain area for the upper is 1.464. Our curtain area for the lower is 1.673. These added together is a 3.137 total curtain area. But you can't look at the mass speed flow at the two added together, because what's going to happen is this upper one, which is paired with your front 3 cylinders, is going to go into a speed choke before the lower one, because they're two different sizes, and that smallest one is going to go into the speed choke before. So these are two individual curtain areas. So how this is working is the gas enters these two ports. Remember, the exhaust manifold's expanded it to a controlled level. That's what we're asking the manifold to do, is move that exhaust gas from the valve to the turbine housing and do a little bit of expansion along the way. Then it goes into the scroll, or whatever you want to call it. You can look at these as just two ports. From here into here, this is our next expansion control device. So this housing is allowing a predicted amount of expansion to occur. That way, when it goes to be recompressed by the exhaust gas behind it through the nozzle, the speed of that gas through the nozzle is in an acceptable range. It's at the designed target range. What that design target is, no idea. I didn't know how to design the housing. I can just tell you what it does on a dyno. And it's not just my dyno. It's taking data from a bunch of different dynos all over the United States. On a 5.9 liter engine, you're going to reach a choke condition with this turbine housing with the factory turbine wheel from about 1900 RPMs to 2150 RPMs. You can't push it out any farther without altering the housing. Well, you can go in, and that's because these curtain areas are small. So it's a 1.464 and a 1.673. They're individuals. So it comes into the housing, it's expanding, and then gets pressurized through this nozzle, and it accelerates, and then convert that acceleration into a decel on the turbine wheel at the proper angles and all kinds of other crap that we can do on another one to produce shaft torque on the turbine wheel. So if you leave the nozzle alone and you make this bigger, 14 centimeter, and allow more expansion to occur before it goes through the nozzle, this speed rate at which it climbs over time to reach that max flow condition gets pushed to a higher engine speed. So instead of the 12, you can go to the 14. A lot of us have experience with 14s. They'll go to a higher engine speed, and they tend to do EGT control a little bit better up in that 1900 plus RPM range. And that's because speed through here is at less of a detrimental flow speed, and our volumetric efficiency is holding out better, meaning that the motor is consuming more fresh air, it's mixing better, and a lot of, all that great stuff's occurring. Remember, they're two individuals, so you have to look at them individually. You can add them together to get a total, but as far as looking for the choke flow points, it's going to go into a speed critical zone inside either one of those nozzles. So what can you do to make this flow more? You can knock that divider back. If you knock the divider back far enough to increase those curtain areas, it will flow more, because we're delaying the onset of the choke flow in the turbine housing. There's a trade-off at lower engine speeds because it's a fixed engine size, and we're not changing the engine size. The flow through those nozzles is going to slow down, and the shaft work produced by the turbine wheel is going to go down at those lower speeds. So there's a trade-off for everything. So that's why you're playing around with how much expansion do you want to do before it gets accelerated through this nozzle. And that's why it's important to not just look at the centimeter size, but to go look at the nozzle sizing and everything else. There's enough data out there on what these things do. You don't even got to go that far, but if you want to kind of know about what's going on, that's what's occurring. So That was a 12 centimeter. Let's go to the S300 0.80 T3 with the 8071 turbine wheel. So let's go down here, put it back. Bring this guy up. 0.225 is the nozzle sizing. There's two of them. The opening at the top for our valve diameter, 3.180. So this comes out to a curtain area per nozzle slot of 2.20. We see that that's considerably larger than the 12 centimeter, being the 1.464 and the 1.673. We can infer from that, before even running the turbocharger, that this turbocharger is not going to make the same torque at 1600 RPMs that the 12 centimeter does. In the case of this application, that's totally fine. We're not looking for this thing to run at 1600 RPMs. We're looking for this thing to run very good at, say, 2100, 2300 RPMs. From experience, I don't have data on the 8071, but this housing with the 7868 in it tends to go into peak torque at about 2500 RPMs. Plenty of compressor wheels left on the table most of the time. It's this housing itself going into choke flow, and more than likely it's choke flow due to the nozzle size. It's typically what happens on these divided housings. So this is a 0.80. I think the 12 centimeter is like a 0.70. 14 centimeters is supposed to be equal to the 0.80. So total is a 4.403 total area, but we want to look at the areas individually because it is a divided housing. So we're dealing with a 2.20 curtain area on this housing with 14 centimeters or 0.80 worth of expansion. So we are letting the gas expand more before going through that fixed curtain area, and the curtain area itself is larger than the 12. So you pair those two together, more expansion, it's going to delay the onset of the choke condition, meaning it's going to operate at higher engine speeds, and the nozzle is bigger, so the rate at which the speed to the nozzle climbs as engine speed goes up is going to be longer. This helps move peak torque to the right. So you have two things working to help move peak torque to the right. Remember, when you do that, it has to trade off somewhere, and it trades off at speed of the gas through the nozzle at lower engine speeds. That's totally fine as long as we're trying to get these to work at the higher engine speeds. But this is not a 1600 RPM housing. This is 2300 RPM housing is kind of the ideal. 21 to 2500 is where this thing's going to really shine. Should carry peak, should see peak horsepower from 2700 to 3000, somewhere in there. Just depends on how it goes into the flow. The rate at which you can carry horsepower away from peak torque tends to be the rate at which these increase drive over boost, which is going to be as the pressure in here continues to rise and this nozzle doesn't want to flow anymore. Typically, the faster this goes into choke flow and the faster the rate of rise over time is, the more peaky that torque is. So it'll go into peak torque and then come off of peak torque hard, and that'll cut off how far out you can locate peak horsepower, because it's a mathematical formula to figure the either one of those out. So if it goes into a choke flow gradually, you'll see peak horsepower will be farther away from peak torque, and if it goes into it and goes into it hard, so basically what that means is the pressure inside the scroll is rising, but the flow rate through the nozzle is staying fairly static, versus the pressure in the scroll is rising, but the flow rate through the nozzle is still increasing more than it is in, like, say, this particular system versus another one. So that's the 80. Now we're going to go look at the villain on the S300. is a considerably tighter housing. It's a 9 centimeter housing. But if we look at our nozzle size, it's considerably larger. So we went from a dual nozzle with each nozzle being 0.225 inch to a single nozzle that is 0.6 inch. So if we do go and rerun all this stuff, this is also a little bit bigger just because it's made and machined. We've got a 3.22 opening with a 0.6 opening here. So valve diameter times 0.98 times 3.14 times lift, 3.22 times 0.98 times 3.14 times 0.6 gives us a single number, because there's only one scroll, of 5.945 curtain area. So we're dealing with a single curtain area that is massively larger than the other ones. And if this is how it was in those divided housings with two of those equaling this, we would expect it to be an extremely lazy turbocharger. But remember, the housings are a tool. By dropping down in housing size to say a 9 centimeter housing, we're letting the gas expand less. So because there's less expansion through it, we can get away with the larger nozzle size. So even though it's a very large nozzle, there's a lot less expansion occurring in the housing, meaning that the flow speed through the nozzle is going to maintain better. If this was, a 12 centimeter housing with the single open, it would probably be a pretty big dog. It would make it probably a ton of power, but it would be probably pretty doggy because we're letting the exhaust gas do a lot of expansion before we finally introduce it through the nozzle and try to accelerate what's left over and do shaft work with it. By limiting expansion and then feeding it through into the nozzle, we don't lose as much speed, if that comes across correctly, by dropping the size down. And because it's one big nozzle instead of a small one, this tends to offset or delay the onset of the speed through the nozzle going critical so soon, because it's one large nozzle. So it takes a lot more work to get the one large nozzle to go into a speed critical zone where we're going to see the point where the pressure is going to continue to rise in the scroll and the flow rate through the nozzle is going to stay stagnant or rise very small compared to the rise in the scroll or volute itself. So by going with one large one that has a much larger curtain area and limiting the expansion, we can still maintain good gas speed through the nozzle. And because it's so big, its rise over time of speed tends to be a little flatter. And what this does is it lets us carry out where it's going to go into that sonic location and then predict or control where peak torque's at. So how you use this data is you make the housing and you test it, and then you say, does the housing need to spool the system faster? In that case, we would drop down this size here, or we can drop down nozzle size here. Typically, nozzle size minimum and target, generally speaking, is going to be the exact same size as the inducer. So in a lot of cases, that can't change, without turbine will change, so you can drop this down. And in this case here is a 6 centimeter housing. This is an HX30 housing that's been modified to fit an HX3540 with the big turbine wheel. As we see, its scroll volume is extremely small. It has extremely minimal, it has a massive nozzle, but there's extremely little expansion occurring inside of this housing. And by doing that, we maintain pretty good gas speed through it even at low engine speeds, and as the engine speed increases, the nozzle speed doesn't just go through the roof out of nowhere. It carries more flat because the curtain area is large. So this amount of flow required to get that large curtain area to increase its speed is a lot greater than what it does through those smaller nozzle and the divided. By no means does this mean that the divideds don't work. You can take a divided and go ahead and knock the divider way back. But just remember that those divided housings tend to be larger housings. It's the reason why there's a divider in there. And when you do that, you're going to start, it has a high probability of becoming extremely slow to spool. So this is the villain housing. This is going on this S300 that's right here. HX40 outlet drop 9 centimeter. Um, 3.040 opening, 5.25 nozzle opening. So if we go do our curtain angle or curtain area calculations, we're going to get a 4.911. So after doing this, it kind of makes sense why this housing does seem to spool faster than the bolt-in 9, and we'll get to that. But this is going to be a hair slower than the 351 and a little bit faster than the drop-in 9, and that's because the nozzle size is changing. So we said we have a single 4.911. The .80 is a 2.225s. The 12 centimeter is a 0.140 and a 0.160 inch nozzle. So if we go to the 351 here, 351 has a 0.503 nozzle opening. And these are all 67 millimeter ones. This is not the stock 351. This is set up for a 76, 67, 10 blade. That comes out to 4.705 curtain area, so it's a little bit smaller. We know we can make big power on these 351s, so we can expect this guy here with a little bit more curtain area to produce just a little bit more. Not a big change. I mean, if you needed maybe 10 horsepower to get past a hundo number, then it'd probably do the trick. But you could just take this and open that nozzle up. Do the same thing. The drop-in 9. This guy has a really big nozzle opening. It's a 0.570. So if we do all our math again, we get a 5.332 curtain area on the bolt-in. And this probably explains why the bolt-ins don't have the same issues with surging that this guy does and this guy does, because in fact it's a little bit it is less efficient at those lower engine speeds than these two housings because its nozzle size is bigger. Also probably a contributing factor as to what is allowing this turbocharger to still locate peak torque at the same spot as a milled out 12 while still producing more boost everywhere compared to the 12 milled out 12. Is that not the speed through it? Because compared to say a milled out 12, we're looking at a 3.137 total. This thing is a 5.332 total. So even if you knock the divider out of the 12, this is still a bigger nozzle than the 12 centimeter. S483 turbine, it has 2.19 nozzles with a 3.467 opening. This comes out to a 2.027 curtain area. There's two of them, so you have a total of 4.054. But you want to look at the as a single unit. So it's a 2.027 curtain area, and this in comparison to the 80 is actually a little bit bigger. And this is probably lines up with why we tend to see the 83 turbine, the turbine S400 housings seem to like to locate peak torque at about the same RPM as the big turbine S3s do. S300 0.91 T4, 2.270 nozzle openings, total current area of 2.64 per nozzle, 5.284. This is on a factory board 0.91 T4 housing, which is pretty killer if we look at those. So if we were to measure, look at all these things, and we go look at where peak torques are locating on the dynagraph, pretty dead on. Not as far as what RPM they're going to be at, but as far as making a nozzle size change and then expecting that peak torque to change its location respectively of the size of the nozzle itself. Not too big of a difference between the S483 and the S3.91. So the 10 and the 91, it might even be it's so rusty, it might even be a 91 T4. It's hard to see, but yep. So hopefully this was helpful as to like why it matters so much, because it's kind of like I said, it's my job to look at what the system's doing and then make an educated decision on what's going to do what you're looking for. Like, say you're having EGT issues down at low RPMs, then I'm not going to solve it by putting it in a big 0.80 or a 0.91 T4, because that's the wrong charger for the application. And likewise, if you need the engine, regardless of the horsepower, if you need the engine to operate 3,500 RPMs efficiently, 4,000 RPMs efficiently, we need to go look at a housing that's going to locate these choke flow locations in it up at those engine speeds, so the motor will maintain good volumetric efficiency up at those speeds. So what that does is helps it produce wheel horsepower at those engine speeds, helps keep EGT control under control at those engine speeds, helps keep the brake specific numbers down, which is more efficient at those engine speeds. So it allows us to produce more power with less fuel and control EGTs so your motor stays alive and the thing's happy as can be. So there's not any one right housing that's the way to go. It's collecting data on all the individual housings and then selecting the one that's going to do what you're asking it to do the best. Is it going to do stuff not that great in other places? Probably. It's physics. You can't get around that. What does seem to be doing really good is these 9 housings here. And there's nothing wrong with the 6 housing. The issue with the 6 housing is the turbine wheel. The turbine wheel is not strong enough to handle the pressure that's created there. If we compare, this is a 6. Compare the scroll sizes here. Here's the 9. Here's a 0.80, 0.91 T4. The turbine wheel tends to predict how much boost pressure we can run efficiently. And then from there, that efficient number trends to stay the same, the pressure number. And from there, we decide where we want that pressure number to be reached at and for what RPM range do we want to carry that pressure number for. Because below and above those points, where basically way below it, the thing's inefficient, and way above it, the thing's inefficient. So we're trying to choose, just like how you would choose a camshaft or a cylinder head, where it's going to run and where it's going to run the most efficient. So hopefully this was helpful. Longer video, but hopefully a lot of good stuff in it. All the different housings. We're going to finish up recording this upgrade from the .80 to this 9 centimeter housing for this 8071 on the S300. Go over wastegates maybe on another video because this one's getting long. So thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye.